Hi, my name is Liz Bice, and I am a prosecutor in the Crimes Against Children Division in the District Attorney's Office in McLennan County, Texas. So sometimes when I'm talking to a pool of jurors, potential jurors trying to pick a jury, I'll use an illustration with a $100 bill, and I'll hold it up and I'll say, if I just offered this to anybody, who would want it? Everybody raises their hand, of course. Then I say, well, what if I put it in a pile of mud and got it really disgusting, crumpled it up and made it wrinkled and then offered it to you? Who would want it? And of course, they all still raise their hand. And I'll say, maybe, what if I rubbed it on the subway handle, in the middle of COVID? Anyone still want it? Yes, of course, they'll raise their hand. And the idea is that that $100 bill, by nature of it being a $100 bill, has intrinsic value. And then I try to make the connection to human beings. Human beings have intrinsic value by nature of them being a human being. But sometimes it's a lot harder than you would think to help people see that, because the victims that we work with often don't look shiny and beautiful. They've been through things, they have had hard lives, and they're really rough around the edges. And so educating the decision makers in the process of arrest to conviction in a human trafficking case that these victims have intrinsic value and they're worth fighting for can be a lot more difficult than we think.
I'm Judge Gary Coley, and I'm a Texas State District Judge, and I want to visit with you today about human trafficking and the judicial response we had to human trafficking in our community in Texas. One of the things that's important to understand about human trafficking is that you have to take a different approach than we do with other types of offenses. One of the examples I've used is that over the years, different types of crimes have been identified, such as computer crimes or internet crimes. Law enforcement had to adapt how they prosecuted and investigated those types of cases. We believe a different approach is also needed in human trafficking cases to successfully prosecute those crimes and also help the victims. I became a judge in 2009, but prior to that, I'd been a prosecutor and I'd also been in private practice as a lawyer. Some of the cases I handled included juvenile cases, child welfare cases, and criminal cases. My exposure in each of those areas helped me understand the types of environments some of these kids were coming from that have been abused or neglected in their homes. It also gave me an opportunity to not only handle cases from the state's perspective, but also the perspective of juveniles that have been charged with committing crimes. There's a lot of different advice that we could give when you set up your task force or your coalition in your community, but I'm not going to try to list all of those things in this video. Know that there are many of us who have stumbled and fallen and gotten back up and learned from our mistakes. One of the important things I would suggest, though, is to know that you have to have an open mind in learning what this looks like. What you think it looks like is often very, very different than what it actually is. And going in with a mindset that you know what's going on can be a real obstacle to learning about human trafficking and making a change. So I would encourage you to listen and take those things in. And think back on situations in kids' lives and in adults' lives to things you might not have recognized previously. The stories that adults and kids share about being victimized are not stories they talk about in public. They're stories that are part of their nightmares. But only through training and education can you learn about those things. One of the important adjustments we made in our community was how we engaged with victims. We quit asking what's wrong with you, and we asked what happened to you. What have you experienced? Because it was in asking those questions that we came to understand the trauma that they'd endured. That made it possible to talk to those kids and victims, to learn from them, to help them. But that's a key transformation, because often these kids come into the system having committed a crime or having been non-compliant or combative at school. We engaged with these kids initially often when it looked like they had done something wrong. So learning to ask the questions of what have you been through and not What's wrong with you is so important. And once you identify those kids or adults who have been victimized, you have to let them know you're not going to give up on them. Often it takes 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes more attempts to reach them and to work with them and to get them to share and open up even part of their life experiences. But the reassurance to them that you're with them and you'll be by their side is so important. Indicating to them that they have to do something to comply with your attempts to help them just is not going to be successful. You have to assure them you're there in the long haul for them. As I learned in the role as a judge is that often when kids would appear in court, the position of authority that the judge has can be one that's intimidating, menacing, and can bring out a response in those kids that's unexpected. It can be a response that's volatile. It can be a response that's abusive. And it can certainly be a response that's not respectful of the court and the judge. Understanding trauma and trauma-related responses will help judges to know when they see some of those responses, that's often not directed at us as the judge. That's often a response to their situation and the trauma they've endured. Making changes and modifications to how you conduct hearings and how you engage with victims in situations like this can be transformative in helping kids make changes and get help. I can't tell you how many kids initially appeared in court and they were disrespectful, abusive, they cursed. We made changes to how we conducted hearings. I gave them space to say things that most kids wouldn't be allowed. But I can't tell you how many of those kids came back and said thank you for giving them the space and the grace to recover.
My name is Kevin Turner. I'm a commander with the Tarrant County Sheriff's Office located in Texas. I serve as a commander over our Human Trafficking Child Exploitation Unit, as well as the Task Force Coordinator for the Tarrant County Human Trafficking Task Force. The impact of human trafficking is serious. It can cause the loss of human rights, cause the loss of one's childhood, and have disruption in families. The victims of human trafficking are often exposed to harsh conditions. They often lack protective gear, and he also sustains substantial health risks, including sexually transmitted infections as well as substance abuse. Traffickers dehumanize their victim. They strip them of their innate rights and basically eliminate all their senses of safety and choice and self-empowerment. Traffickers may isolate their victims from their social circles, thus causing them unable to cry out for help. When trafficked internationally, victims often are unaware or unfamiliar with the language or the geography in which they are trafficked to, and thus results in them not being able to cry out for help. Trafficking victims are sometimes forced to commit criminal activities, often referred to as forced criminality, from their traffickers. There was a case up in the northern portion of the United States in which an individual was engaging young boys and men and engaging them in a sexually explicit manner, and he'd often record those interactions. Subsequently, he would use those as a means of coercion in order to force those individuals to sell drugs for him. Him taking these videos was some form of blackmail that resulted in him coercing these victims into selling his drugs, thus resulting in them committing a crime, yet he was forcing them to do so. Having a criminal record can prevent survivors from engaging or accessing certain services. Oftentimes they are denied rent or aid based off their criminal record. Victims rarely make outcries for a variety of reasons. Sometimes the victim's current situation is better than what they left. Sometimes they are misled by their trafficker and they don't understand their rights. They also sometimes use a sense of loyalty in order to coerce the victim. They will maybe engage in a romantic relationship with the victim, and then during it some course, they'll convince the victim that if you truly love me, you'll do this for me. And then in turn force the victim to engage usually in prostitution or any other some type of criminal act. They also do not make outcries that they have a fear of law enforcement for a variety of reasons. Often, anytime they've engaged with law enforcement, may have resulted in their arrest. But those that are immigrants into a country often fear deportation as well. So any engagement with law enforcement leads them to believe that they will be deported if they make an outcry. This is one of the driving coercion that traffickers use against their victims. Traffickers often tell the victim that if they do not do what they do, that they are going to harm their family members. This causes the victim to be more coerced and susceptible to victimization. Being proactive in trying to identify victims really means engaging with those areas within the community that likely our victims are reaching out to. This includes the medical professionals, schools, as well as our victim service providers. One key to proactive identification is information sharing. When law enforcement shares information, they are more likely to identify victims and traffickers. As trafficking is a very transient crime, it is often that these crimes can occur in multiple jurisdictions. With this law enforcement sharing information, they're able to better identify victims and traffickers, and this come together for a more prosecutable case. For instance, you may have a trafficker that has multiple cases of assaults across different jurisdictions, and looking at those independently, yes, those don't appear more than a simple assault case. However, collectively, when you put all of that together, you can see a clear-cut pattern of trafficking and thus being able to prosecute that individual. For one instance, there was an agency that was looking at an individual that they believed was a trafficker. They identified him through basically a hotel. Management had notified them of the incident. And initially, when they looked at it, they were unable to make any identification of any victims and or whether he truly was a trafficker. However, when they started to reach out to other agencies, they found the same individual was operating or doing similar activity down in the Houston area. And when the two agencies started to share information, they were able to actually identify several victims that this trafficker had been forced into prostitution. That resulted in several criminal cases for continuous trafficking. We often look beyond the criminal offense which an individual is charged with. There are, again, sometimes where forced criminality upon the victim resulted in them committing offenses which they may be arrested, whether that be retail theft, begging, and or even narcotics distribution. But by looking beyond the initial charge and really trying to make a better understanding of what the reasoning behind this arrest can result in identification of a victim. For instance, in our jail, we have a confinement screening tool in which we actually have our personnel trained to ask and look for key indicators of human trafficking. If they see those indicators in individuals that are being brought into our jail, then they reach out to a human trafficking investigator to follow up on it. We also do selective outreach in both our adult jail and our juvenile detention center by allowing victim service providers to come out and make contact with individuals that are in jail. This provides them with some resources to potentially make an outcry without actually involving law enforcement. We've had several successful attempts in identifying victims this way. Recently, we were able to conduct a human trafficking summit, and part of that was we were able to do a virtual broadcast into our confinement facility. There was about 35 individuals that attended that virtual presentation that were currently confined in our Tarrant County Jail. And after the presentation was done, there were 12 outcries made by individuals saying that they were victims of human trafficking. When we did the summit, it was basically a simple understanding of what human trafficking is, some of the indicators, but we also had a survivor leader that was a keynote speaker, and she talked about her victimization. And I think that was one of the driving forces behind the several outcries we had in our jail. Once the outcries were made, victim service providers were on scene to provide immediate support. They were able to engage in services at that time and really provide them the ability to start that feeling and restoring themselves, through self-empowerment, as well as feeling a sense of safety and choice. We have a screening tool that identifies several risk indicators that we use during our operations. We will often go on to and look at ads that are being posted on adult sex sites. And these ads often have pictures and content within the ad as well as phone numbers. We're able to look at these through specific indicators. For instance, the pictures that are posted in the ad is the individual, does it look like the pictures are being taken in a hotel room? Does it appear that there's a third party taking the picture? Are there any visible tattoos that may show type of maybe branding? Or is there bruising indicating that maybe this individual is being subjected to force? We also look at the ad itself as far as the content of the ad to see if there's some maybe indicators that there may be a trafficking nexus. We also look at the phone number and do an analysis of the phone number. When we trail that phone number in those ads, do we see multiple ads being posted in multiple cities? Do we see multiple ads with the same phone number, yet there are different women being posted on there? So using all of those indicators helps us better hone in on specific individuals that may be potential victims of human trafficking. Well, oftentimes if we're able to identify a potential victim, what we'll do is try to reach out to the victim under the pretense of us being a commercial sex buyer. We'll often have a hotel room in which they can meet us. And once they come to the location, we do not arrest them. It is a simple contact, identifying ourselves as law enforcement and telling them we'd like to talk to them. At that point, we're able to have a better conversation at a different location in order to maybe identify them as a potential victim. But we also look for is who brings them to the location. Do they drive themselves, or does somebody bring them to the location? If there's a third party that brings them to the location, then that's really some of our efforts focus on that individual. Is this a potential trafficker, or is this just a rideshare individual? We have to really make those determinations, based off some of the information that we get from the victim when we talk to them initially. But based off all of those, we also look at the phone in which we made the communication with. Does the phone number that we contacted in possession of the victim, or does somebody else have possession of that phone? If somebody else is in possession of that phone, that often indicates a potential trafficking situation where a third party is maybe setting up these arrangements for the victim, and thus resulting in them being able to profit off of this. In Texas, prostitution is illegal. However, it is not our focus to arrest those individuals that are involved in commercial sex and that side of things. We really look at those individuals as potential victims of human trafficking, and that's how we address it. We do not make arrests. We do not charge those individuals. And we often have them engage with victim service providers that are there with us and see if we can actually remove them from this exploitive lifestyle. By doing so, that also reduces their chance of victimization. Our main focus when it comes to prostitution is really on the buyer side of things, where we're actively engaged in arresting those individuals that are driving demand for sex trafficking. By doing that, we hope that the demand will go down, thus resulting in less victims. So we're taking a hard stance on that. In fact, the state of Texas is the first state in the country to make a first-time charge for solicitation of prostitution a felony offense. And this was very forward-thinking by our legislators to understand that how this can help us drive down demand for sex trafficking. I think this is a very strong approach towards addressing human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking in the state of Texas, because it really helps us focus our efforts on the buyer that are driving the demand. But it also makes us give the ability to provide those resources to potential victims and help them. By doing so, again, we're being able to reduce the victimization as well as trying to help them remove themselves from that exploitative lifestyle when they're ready. And this is very important because if they're not in that position that they can be exploited, then there's less likelihood of victimization. As law enforcement, our job is to see the victim and help the victim. During these operations, when we make contact with a potential victim, we'll transport them to a secondary location. We do not like to conduct interviews in motel room because that is where a majority of the victimization is taking place. By taking them to a secondary location and using a soft interview room, this lessens the anxiety of the victim. A soft interview room is much like anybody's personal room. It's set up with our couches and chairs and tables and lamps and plants and pictures to kind of give it a more pleasant appearance compared to a sterile interview room. This really has broken down a lot of barriers for us. Again, it releases the anxiety of the victim, but it also gives them a feeling of safety. By using trauma-informed interview techniques and really trying to engage with the victims, we understand there's sometimes just basic needs that will help them feel more safe, whether that's just being providing them a bottle of water, providing them some food, or sometimes some warm clothing. Oftentimes, our potential victims are dressed in a manner that is not well suited for the weather conditions. So, just providing them warm clothes helps them have a better sense of safety and choice, and really feels that these individuals are really trying to help me and not looking at trying to arrest me. When we talk to our victim, we use a very conversational approach, allowing them to have some choices in like where they would like to sit, when they would like to take breaks. And this all really helps in building rapport with the potential victim. Without building rapport, there's less likely chance that we're going to have any potential outcries made. But again, our goal is, again, we would love to prosecute that trafficker, but our victim is the primary focus at this time. And really, with their needs, they're feeling a choice, they're feeling a safety, and try to really engage, where they're feeling a self-empowered, is really what our primary goal is. And when they're ready to talk to us and law enforcement and come to us and talk to us, we will be here. But we allow that to happen on their time frame, on their timeline, and when they choose to do so. One thing we have seen with these operations is once we're done with the initial interview, we immediately have them or allow them to engage with our victim service providers to provide them the resources they need. We're concluded with the operation in the sense of the interview and them engaging with our victim service provider. We allow the victim to make the choice. If they want to engage and lead with the victim service provider, make an outcry, whatever that situation may be, then we're ready for that. But if they do not, then they are free to leave. We do not make arrests. We are trying to build that rapport as we move forward, because on average, their victims engage with law enforcement 7 to 8 times before they make their outcries. So we're not sure if we're on engagement number 1 or engagement number 7. But again, our goal is not to arrest them, but really provide them the resources they need. With being victim-centered, we really put them and their needs priority 1. We ensure that they have everything they need in order to feel safe, to feel like they have a sense of choice, and really start to regain their sense of freedom through self-empowerment. All of those have been stripped from them during their victimization. By doing this, it helps them in the recovery, and it also helps them when they begin to feel like they are ready to engage with law enforcement and talk about their trafficker and potentially prosecute that individual. Being trauma-informed really has the best is to have a good understanding of how trauma impacts our victims, and understand that some of the reactions that we get from them is not necessarily based off maybe a potential dislike of one particular group or anything, but it's just based off the trauma they've endured. And some of that trauma has occurred during their childhood and then has continued during their victims of trafficking.
We have victims who might not be able to stay in the country legally, and especially in the cases of some of the bigger labor trafficking cases that I've worked, the trafficker was taking care of the victim's place to live, job, income, whatever that looked like. And so then we arrest the trafficker, and all of a sudden a victim is homeless. The victim doesn't have a job. They probably don't speak the language in our country. And they don't have any idea about things like minimum wage or what job opportunities they might have. And so that can be really scary for a victim, especially if the victim's main objective in coming to the U.S. to get a job was to be able to send money back home. Many times the victims we've spoken to have said that they were still able to send money home while they were being trafficked, and that's the main reason they were in the country in the first place. And so those things, when they suddenly disappear for our victims, can make them reluctant to cooperate in the prosecution, and also creates a huge need for social services providers and nonprofits to come in and help those victims in order for them to, one, survive really until the trial comes, and 2, to realize that we are trying to help them, because it can look like we've just taken away the roof over their head, the food of their mouth, and their means of existing in the world as they know it. We worked a case back in my hometown, and this establishment was a massage parlor. The massage the masseuse, the workers, I'm not really sure, the victims, were being forced to give massages. They were being forced to work for less than minimum wage. And at the end of the massage, they were being forced to provide sexual favors to the clients if they wanted them. The victims lived in the massage parlor. They slept on the beds at night. They weren't allowed to go anywhere. The traffickers brought in the food that they were allowed to have. In the back of the massage parlor, when we did the raid, there were like rice cookers and crock pots and microwaves. You could tell they'd been living there, making their food there, and what have you. Most of the victims were from another country. So the law enforcement officer who conducted this case did all his research to gather the elements of the offense, right? In trafficking, you have to have force, fraud, or coercion causing somebody to work for less than minimum wage or to perform commercial sex. And he had gathered all the evidence for those elements of it and did the raid. However, when he did, all of these people were suddenly homeless. They didn't speak the language. They didn't even know what town they were in. And they didn't have a way to stay in the country. And so by the time I got it in my office, all I was able to prove up was a charge called aggravated promotion of prostitution, which is a lesser degree felony than human trafficking. So I just called the detective and I said, hey, this is what I've got. All the victims have disappeared. They don't want to talk to me. I can't go forward. The statements that he got from them were done through a volunteer from our local university who spoke the language. And so they didn't have any sort of official translator designation to them. And so I couldn't even use the statements that they had made. And they were all very scared to talk to me. And so we kind of talked through it and through the problems of when I get to trial, I have to prove these elements. I can't prove these elements without a victim. And he recognized that, and we kind of agreed to see this conviction for a lesser crime as still a victory because we were able to get a conviction of the trafficker and then take what we've learned from that and apply it to the next case. So we learned that we need to have official translators. We need to have somebody from an immigration law firm there on scene. So we started incorporating a girl in our community who does immigration work. And we needed to incorporate nonprofits. So we have the organization Unbound and several others like it in our community. And those people have started coming on the stings. And if the law enforcement officers know ahead of time, hey, this is how many victims that I'm anticipating. And we have the immigration girl who can say, this is how many months that I'm going to need to get them visas to stay in the country. That helps the nonprofits be able to prepare for, this is how long we're going to need to provide a place to stay and food for these victims so that they can still be there when the case comes to trial. Because I'm just a prosecutor. I can't do all of those other things. All I can do is try the case with the evidence that I have in my file. And if the evidence that I have available to me doesn't include a victim, I don't have a case. So I need those other organizations to come and provide and fill in the gap for the needs that these victims have in order to be successful at what I want to do, which is get a conviction for a trafficker. Another problem that we have in prosecuting these cases comes in, I would say, the broad category of evidence. In the system in Texas that we work with, the time from arrest to trial can be several years. And so if you don't gather all the evidence at the beginning, it's not going to be there years later when you're going to trial. A lot of times, too, though, these traffickers are trying to work their system without leaving a paper trail. So with labor trafficking, for example, I might not have a whole lot of evidence. We might have to get a money laundering conviction or something else that puts a trafficker in our criminal justice system, puts them on our radar, and just kind of be happy with that. But we've learned to see those as victories too, just kind of based on what evidence we have available, as long as we're learning from each case and how to do it better the next time. Another category that presents challenges in prosecuting these cases is education. And by this, I mean education of people in the entire chain of folks who lay their hands on a case from arrest to conviction. in Texas, we have a jury system. So that even includes general members of the community, because those are the people that make up my jury pools. For example, you might have a victim that has been through a lot of trauma. Most of them have, right? And when they are in court, when they're being talked to by a male, for example, if they had a male trafficker, and they get triggered and they start yelling and screaming and cursing, which is not at all what you would want your client to do in court if they're coming in for their own criminal case, for example, or if they're on the witness stand and I'm trying to get out a narrative of what happened to them in front of a jury, and they start yelling or cussing or they shut down, recognizing those things as trauma behaviors and not like, this is just a crazy person, or this is just a person who's out of control. So we have to educate the people who are making the decisions to see that for what it is. Another piece of education that's been really important is educating the whole system to see a victim as a victim. Many times these victims, either they have a drug addiction or their trafficker creates an addiction to help keep them compliant, or they have a drug addiction that uses a coping mechanism to just survive the horrific conditions that they're living in. So they might catch a drug charge. They'll probably have an inherent fear of the police or law enforcement, anything like that, especially if they're not here in the country legally. Then they'll be very nervous about being deported or being caught without their papers or what have you. And so if they see a police officer, they don't necessarily see that person as somebody who could help them. They see that person as somebody to run from. So maybe they catch an evading charge. Or maybe when they talk to somebody, an interaction goes from like 0 to 90 real fast, and they get themselves into like a physical altercation. They've got an assault charge, And so a lot of times we have these victims coming into our system looking like defendants at first. And then you put all the pieces together and you say, oh, this person's actually a victim, right? But by that time, they have 3 pending cases. And so that can be hard for juries, for judges a lot of times, and even for law enforcement or prosecutors to see that person as a victim instead of just another criminal. We're trying to educate people on how to recognize a victim, which can be hard for people who are used to recognizing criminal defendants to see someone who has criminal charges as a victim. So one of the main things that we look for is what they're saying. And the education piece is huge. For example, we have a judge who is in charge of the juvenile justice system and the child welfare system, who's very well versed in trafficking and in the dynamics of trafficking, and so is able to recognize these kiddos when they come through his court for what they are. For a while, I represented children as a juvenile defense attorney, and I was able to speak very frankly with him, with this judge, and with the prosecutor in those cases about victims. I had a client one time who had several charges. She had an evading charge. She had, I think it was engaging in organized crime, where she and several friends went to Walmart and stole some food, and she was the getaway driver. And so she had that and a theft charge. She had, I think, probably an assault charge too. But talking with her and talking with her caseworker for her child welfare case, we knew that she had been the victim of trafficking. She had a lot of sexual assault in her background. She was still a minor. She was moving around from place to place. So we were able to pick up on the things that she was saying because that presents another problem. A lot of times the victims themselves don't even recognize that they're a victim. And so we're not even just talking about education for people who are working these cases, but the people in these cases and in these situations don't always self-identify as victims. So that can be really hard. She was defiant. I'm taking care of myself. I'm making my own decisions. But anyway, she had those charges pending. We were trying to work out where can we send her that will get her help instead of being punitive. And while she had these charges pending, she was out on conditions of release, and she had an ankle monitor. She was out for maybe 36 hours, or less than a day or two. It was a really short amount of time. And she got arrested or pulled over at 1 a.m. So she's broken her curfew. She was going the wrong way down a one-way street. And in her front seat, she had lube, condoms, lingerie, and a giant bag of marijuana. and she was shaking when the officer pulled her over. But luckily for this kiddo, we had the officer who had education in trafficking and what this looks like, and he was sort of able to put this whole picture together. Okay, we have a child who's a runaway, who's breaking curfew, who's scared out of her mind, and obviously had been out doing some sexual activities in the middle of the night, and didn't arrest her for violating her conditions of release or, any of the other possession of marijuana like he could have, and was able to find the placement paperwork, the CPS placement paperwork in the car, and returned her back home, and then told us about it, told juvenile probation, told myself, and told the court. So then we had a hearing about it, and I was able to say, like, hey, judge, this is what happened to my client, and here's the circumstances. Ordinarily, as a defense attorney, you don't give the judge and the prosecutor just information about your client that's going to catch them new charges. I mean, you just don't do that. You keep those things close to the chest, and you make the state prove all that stuff. But because the folks in this circle had education about what was going on, even though the victim didn't self-identify and didn't realize what was happening to her, all the adults working on her case did. And we were able to get her placed in a facility that was specifically for helping victims of human trafficking, girls, minors. And I think it's the last that my knowledge, she was doing really well there. And so that was a victory that we were only able to have because everybody in the process had education on the dynamics of trafficking, especially since she didn't present. She was saying, no, I'm not being trafficked. I'm not doing this against my will. But we could see it for what it was. It really took a mindset shift for us to look at her and see her as a victim instead of doing the easy thing, what was on the surface, and putting another charge on her and sending her to juvenile. Another piece that we look for is what they're not telling us. So we know if we've been working in this field and have been educated in the dynamics of trafficking, that sometimes what they're not telling you is just as powerful as what they are telling you. There's a lot of fear involved. There's a lot of manipulation. And so sometimes the victims, when they don't identify as victims or when they're too scared to tell you what's going on, that can tell you a lot. One of the things that's been essential in successfully prosecuting these cases is having collaboration across the board. We have to have people in all the lanes working toward helping our victims and getting people out of this life. All right, so one of the things that's helped us is integrating trauma-informed techniques and practices into the way we present these cases. So, for example, I might have a victim who hasn't seen their perpetrator in 5 years, and they're about to have to go testify in the same courtroom as the person who abused them. So one of the things that I'll do is before we go to court, I'll have them come up to my office the week before. I'll walk into the courtroom with them. I'll show them the courtroom. I'll have them sit in the chair they're going to sit in. I'll sit in the chair I'm going to sit in, and I'll have the bailiffs stand where they're going to stand. I'll probably get some volunteer, somebody who works in the courtroom, to sit in the chair where the defendant will sit, and then show the kiddo, hey, you can turn your chair this way, you can look this way, here's how you can, equip yourself when you're in that moment. And it sounds like a really simple thing, but I have found that taking the element of the unknown out of the process for the victim as much as possible has been really helpful. Another thing that I do is if they're on the stand and they're shutting down, I'll regroup and I'll draw them back and I'll start asking less dangerous questions or less sensitive questions. So I might start saying, instead of we're talking about the abuse, we're talking about what happened next and then what did you do. And if the child is shutting down, I'll go back to, okay, what was the room like? I'll bring it back out and I'll say, what was the room like? Or do you remember if it was summer or winter? Or I'll talk about something completely not having to do anything with the trauma and bring them back out and give them a chance to regroup. I also give them time to breathe and take deep breaths. It gets them back into their body. When they are in these trauma moments, they're going into fight or flight. So they're not using their frontal lobe. And so the logic and reasoning isn't there. And so if you have them take deep breaths, and these counseling techniques really applied in my field. Deep calming breaths, or give them something to squeeze. It gets them back into their body and it grounds them, and it helps them refocus and regroup and then answer the questions in that moment where they're sitting there facing their perpetrator. So those things sound like really simple things, but I've found them to be extremely helpful in helping a kiddo through that moment. And I say kiddo, a lot of times these people that when they're testifying are adults by the time we come to trial, but it's still when they see the person who's done that abuse to them, it brings them back to that moment, to when they were a little child. And so it can feel just as scary as it was when they were a kid.